By the 1950s, young women, certainly of college age, are starting to push back against certain kinds of rules that are confining to their sexuality. For example, something called parietals on college campuses confined women to their dormitories after a curfew, 10 or 11 o'clock at night, whereas men could stay out as late as they wanted and do whatever they wanted. It was against the rules in most colleges for women and men to have sex with each other, but when people got caught, it was the women who were punished. So young women, particularly on the left, and we have to remember that as early as the late 1940s, young women, African American and white and Latinx, are starting to get involved in civil rights movements. They're starting to get involved in the anti-nuclear movement. They're starting to get involved in the anti-war movement. So women are both taking the examples of ideas about democracy and freedom, and they're applying them to their own situation and saying, well, why am I a criminal? Why am I immoral if I choose to have sex with somebody, but men can do whatever they want, right? So there is a kind of discontent that's bubbling along among young women. I would also say that young women are, by 1964, 65, able to explore their own sexuality more safely because the restrictions on getting birth control are starting to be eased. By 1965, there's a case called Griswold v. Connecticut, a Supreme Court case in which the state of Connecticut is told that the rule confining birth control only to married women is unconstitutional. And the doors come tumbling down in terms of making not just condoms, not just diaphragms and other forms of contraceptives available, but a brand new contraceptive called the pill that a woman can take every month and have sex without fear of getting pregnant. Now, as historian Elaine Tyler May has pointed out, the problem with the pill is that men often presumed if a woman was on the pill, she should be available for sex all the time. That begins to drive an idea about the sexual revolution among women, young women in particular, that it's not just about having sex. It's about having sex on your terms. It's about whether you like having sex or not, whether your boyfriend is doing it in a way you want him to do it. When do you get to say no? Now, this is a huge gray area that women are entering in. But 1965 is sort of the beginning when the court says, yes, women should have access to contraception. That's the beginning of women knowing that they can take sexuality into their own hands and be listened to. One way that feminism is pushing back at the sexual revolution is feminists are saying, yes, we've been part of the sexual revolution, but we didn't enter it on our own terms. What would it mean for a woman to participate in the sexual revolution on her own terms? And that's happening around 1968, 1969. When Candace herself began to imagine that she could become an actress in pornography, she was following the lead of someone I would say is the pioneer of modern pornography in all kinds of ways, good and very sad, Linda Lovelace, who actually prefers the name Linda Borman. It's a name that most people don't know. But Linda became a star in 1973 in a movie called Deep Throat that took the country by storm. It became a focus of a great deal of activity by the police. It was constantly being shut down and moved to another town and opened up again. There were lots of lawsuits filed against it. But basically, Deep Throat survived, and it became the building block of modern pornography, which was movies that had a story to them. Deep Throat became a kind of thing for people to do in couples. right? So Deep Throat is actually the first movie that men take their wives and girlfriends to. It's a kind of porn chic. It's a kind of thing to say that you've done it. But it also horrifies feminists. And so Deep Throat also marks the beginning of the feminist anti-pornography movement, as all kinds of women who have organized around other things. They've organized around consciousness raising. They've organized against violence against women. They are often veterans of the civil rights and peace movements. They see Deep Throat, and what they see is an invitation to sexual violence and rape. And so Deep Throat also becomes the object of protests nationwide by women. And it is out of these protests that comes the group Women Against Pornography. That in fact women reorganize with a specific goal in mind, which is to get violence against women and open forms of sexuality out of popular culture. So by 1974, when Candice Vidala is beginning to imagine herself as a porn star and picking out her first porn star name, she knows she is entering a field that both is offering new opportunities for women, because in fact Linda Lovelace becomes a celebrity because of her work in Deep Throat. But she also knows that she is entering a field that is highly controversial within feminism. So she's actually making a decision, even though she may not know it at the time, about what kind of a feminist is she going to be. Is she going to be a feminist that centers her own sexual agency, that makes decisions about her sexuality, or is she going to be a feminist who sees her sexuality as part of larger systems of oppression? She chooses agency.
When the U.S. mobilized to enter World War II, there was already a precedent for women to serve and assist the military services, because it was done in World War I as auxiliaries. And during World War I, which of course was a much shorter involvement, far, far fewer American men were in the Army, Navy, etc. Women mostly did clerical work. In World War II, the organization of the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, as it was first called, was a much larger endeavor. Of course, technology had changed to the extent that it was just a much more ramified war effort. But it was clear to the commanders that a great proportion of jobs were not combat jobs. In fact, I've heard the statistic that in World War II overall, just among the men in the armed services, that only 1 out of 8 actually saw battle, because there is so much to be done that is not on the battlefield. So it was immediately seen that women who were already 35% of the workforce in the U.S. at peace, that women could be of great help. So the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps was organized, and not a lot of women volunteered. It was seen as rather disappointing. The jobs available were very diverse, really diverse. Many of them were clerical. There was a lot of processing of men to be done. There were, of course, letters to write. But then there was a range of other, what we call white-collar jobs, teletyping, cryptography, weather forecasting. There were radio operators. Women were in the Signal Corps, which was the radio operation. And then there were things that weren't so desk-bound. There was blue-collar work. Women were mechanics. They repaired trucks. They repaired parts of planes. Also, women worked on making sure that ordnance, all sorts of ammunition, was in the right shape. They measured bullets. They went over gunpowder. And almost any kind of non-combat necessity that you can think of, women in the Auxiliary Army Corps were doing this. But there were very few of them. And initially, one of the reasons there were so few of them is that there were scurrilous stories circulated by men including some newspaper people who hated the idea of women being enlisted in this work. And it was said that really they were only being signed up so that they could be there as convenient prostitutes, essentially, for men in the Army. And it was quite a scandal, the publicity about it. So Ovida Kolphabi, who was the woman who was the head of the whole thing, made very certain to emphasize that really enlisting in the WAAC was like going to a select women's college, that everyone was treated very respectably, that the uniforms were great, that there were pictures, tons of pictures, you can still see them, of the bunks they slept in and how neat they kept and what the rules were. She had very, very strict rules, in fact, to show that this was completely respectable. Then on the other hand, there were obverse rumors circulated that really only dykes would want to go into this male-associated kind of work. So sexually, women were sort of skewered from both sides. Either it was prostitution or it was a nest of lesbians. Anyway, there were tens of thousands of women who volunteered. But even at its height, when it transformed into the WAC, the Women's Army Corps, it was only 150,000 women who were in the WAC overall. And there were 16 million men in the armed services in World War II. So, I mean, it's just a vast differential. The most unusual service that women did during World War II, really because this service hadn't existed before, was to become employed by the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. This was an agency that was created during the war, and it is the predecessor to the CIA, which wasn't around yet. So in other words, it was an intelligence service that was working behind the scenes. But because it was started during a war, it had several different modalities. One was there really to inform. This was more the spy agency. All the women in the OSS, and there were only 3,000 or 4,000 of them altogether. They're often called spies. They were not all spies by any means. Some of them probably were, because there was a modality of the OSS that was specifically to inform the strategists in the Defense Department, and they were trying to get undercover information. The women in the OSS, by and large, some of them just came in from civilian life, but some of them were recruited from within the WAC. And that was true of Catherine Keene, that she was already in the WAC when she went over to work for the OSS. But the two were quite separate entities, and one was part of the Army and the other was an independent intelligence agency.